It was an inability of my internal world of being aligned in a proper way. And because that was the issue, I tried everything. I tried like psychedelics, therapy, like all meditation, but it was really the great books and philosophy and literature that I saw was an instruction manual for living a good life.
A bone that I have to pick is this whole idea that we have identified the word myth with untruth in the West, and it couldn't be further from the truth. You abstract out the essence, the moral essence of like, what did we learn from all of this? And you get all of that compressed into this very palatable narrative. You don't need to have interacted with Jesus of Nazareth to imitate Jesus of Nazareth, just through the stories that have been told about him.
When things are working, you don't necessarily need to go to the foundational layer of these ideas. You don't need to ask, what is money? That's a great example. The world is in flux, and that's why we need to revisit these great books, because they contain the source code of civilization.
It almost starts to feel to me like an owner's manual for being human, right? It's like you're...
Yeah, totally.
Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer. Today's podcast is brought to you by In Wolf's Clothing. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times per year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that help fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. So go to wolfnyc.com to learn more about the program or apply. Again, that's wolfnyc, WOLFNYC.com. Johnathan Bi, welcome back to the What is Money Show.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast last time.
Yeah, this is great to see you again. Last time we talked about Rene Girard and Mimetic Desire and his book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, which is a great book. I think we'll talk about a little bit about that today. Just by way of quick reintroduction, you are an entrepreneur and an intellectual, and your latest project, which we're going to talk about today, is The Great Books of the West, which is a lecture and interview series on the Western canon. So maybe we could just start there. I was just telling you offline, I read this book, How to Read a Book, which sounds like a terribly boring book, but it's actually a really good philosophy book. And authors listed 100 books that basically form the foundation of Western civilization. I remember starting with the King James Bible, Iliad, Odyssey, rolling all the way forward to Nietzsche and stuff towards the end. So what is the Western canon? Is that an official list? And if not, where did you derive the list of those books?
Well, there's no official list of the Western canon, but there's a fun backstory to the book that you mentioned of How to Read a Book by a guy called Mortimer Adler, who's one of these education, I think he's associated with Columbia or Chicago in the 20th century. and he's one of the early pioneers of the sort of great books movement in America in the 20th century. But the funny story behind that book is one of the critics wrote as a review of that book that before Mr. Adler wrote a book called How to Read a Book, he should have read a book called How to Write a Book, which is hilarious because it's like reverse critique, right? Anyways, that aside, so the critics, some of the critics, they didn't think highly of that book.
Yeah.
That aside, to answer your question, there's no set list of what the Western canon is. But generally, when we talk about a canon, a civilization's canon, these are the most important books that have some kind of grounding or foundational role in that civilization. And the Bible would be the canonical example. So the obvious question is, Johnathan, well, if you don't have a list, are you just pulling stuff out of your ass, right? And my response here is that, it's not clear if the books on the fringes are in the canon, right? Let's pick, I don't know, Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, right? Which is a very important book. But is that in the canon? Some people think yes, some people think no. But it sure as hell is obvious that the Bible and Republic and Plato's Republic is in the canon, right?
Right.
So the fact that there are some books where we don't know if there's a debate whether that's in the canon doesn't defeat the point that there are certain extremely important books which everyone agrees isn't in the canon, and those are the books that I'm sort of starting with. And so my project is really taking people who might not have had a traditional classical great books education background and explaining these books in 1 to 2 hour lectures, in addition with interviews with top professors about what their core essence and ideas are in a way that's still serious and but also accessible, right, to the layman. So that's really the project.
It's really cool. So obviously a very stark educational focus. Why are you doing this? Like, what is it that motivates you to dive into these great books? And what are you, you said you're trying to make them accessible. I assume you're trying to also learn. All these educational projects that we engage in, we sort of learn and develop in the process. Like, what is it that's motivating you to take this particular path?
Right. So you are right that primarily it's a selfish desire that I'm pursuing this project. Yeah. And the selfish desire is I want an excuse to read these books and talk to these professors.
Yes.
And often the best way to learn these books, as you mentioned, is to teach them, right?
Yes.
And so, maybe a little bit of backstory is helpful here. I grew up really hating the humanities. Okay, I grew up loathing the humanities. And the reason was because I was born and raised in Beijing, China. And you already see some of this in the Western education system, where the most intelligent kids are funneled into STEM and math, and sort of humanities is this kind of like second tier intellectual endeavor. That was magnified in China. So anyone who was like halfway competent was funneled into math competitions. And so I was doing math, and in some ways, being trained in math, you kind of look down upon humanities, right? It's kind of this mushy thing. You don't really get clear answers. It's not clear who's right or wrong. And that intuition very much carried with me throughout college. So I went to college initially to study computer science, and being this sort of trained mathlete. But my freshman year, I dropped out to found a startup, which ended up crashing, burning, and failing. And that was such an existentially dreadful experience that I turned to the great books out of necessity. So it wasn't that I was grounded in it growing up, but I turned to it as an instruction manual. And so the long story short of it is, what I realized afterwards was that, my desires weren't my own, that I dropped out to start the company because I was jealous of my other peers who had done that and who were successful. Because there's a culture today, funnily enough, of dropping out, and people are conforming to this sort of dropout archetype. It's kind of funny in that way, right? Because the dropout is supposed to be a contrarian, but it's gotten so popular that now there's a whole culture and prestige around it, right? So before, you would pursue the goal despite dropping out, but now you pursue the goal because you're able to drop out. And I was definitely in that second camp. And because that failure, right, it wasn't like an inability to make money. It wasn't an inability of me conquering the external world. It was an inability of my internal world of being aligned in a proper way. And because that was the issue, I tried everything. I tried like psychedelics, therapy, like all meditation, but it was really the great books and philosophy and literature that I saw was an instruction manual for living a good life, for sort of lining up your desires, for helping you understand what we're here to do, right? And so, the thing I like to say is, usually when philosophy pops up in history, something very bad has happened. Okay, and so I'll define that. I'll defend that general claim, but let me give you a more personal example. When I look back on my journal, right, I keep a journal that I only write when I feel a need to. All the periods of my life where I'm suffering, I have a lot more journal entries, and there are weeks or months where I have 1 or 2 a week. That's usually when I'm doing really well. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, when things are working, you don't necessarily need to go to the foundational layer of these ideas. The analogy I make is you're trying to debug a system. And if you're trying to build a regular application, you can use a no-code tool, you can program at a very high level. But if what you want to do is to fundamentally create a new operating system, right? Or do optimizations at the hardware level, then you need to go down to the lower level languages, and that's assembly code. And I think it's like that with ideas. If everything's going well in your life, if history is going great, you don't need to ask, what is money? That's a great example, right? You don't need to ask that question. What is money?
If the money works, you don't need to ask.
Yeah, exactly. You don't need to ask it. And you see this in history as well. I mean, think about the Athenian Golden Age, right? Plato and Socrates. That was after they lost the Peloponnesian War, or rather, that was before the Peloponnesian War, but it was this like tumultuous period in Greek history, right? Famously, St. Augustine was responding to the sack of Rome. This was like the unthinkable thing that barbarians could sack Rome, right? Or even Hegel responding to Napoleon in some sense, right? And so I do think we're in that type of world right now where, for example, your question that you asked, what is money? The world is in flux, and that's why we need to revisit these great books, because they contain the source code of civilization. And so that really is the essence of this project, is trying to. It's not a theoretical project. It's very much a practical project. Even if it leads us to theory about how we ought live.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I love that you're invoking the metaphor of kind of software, hardware, because that is really, I think it's the best metaphor for understanding the importance of mythology and literature more specifically. My working sort of description of this now is that we have kind of like the external hard drive of how we've come to this level of human cognition or human civilization, which I really think these are almost the same thing at different levels, right? Like, obviously we internalize our culture, and then we also create our culture. So, we absorb all of this latent cultural programming. For instance, we have the general moral intuition today across most of the world that, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, these very basic moral intuitions, but those aren't prefabricated in the human operating system, right? Like, we developed that. And it's somehow like we observe ourselves acting across history, and then we write stories about ourselves acting across history. And then in that process of reflecting upon how we act across history, we like change the way we act, right? We develop codes of ethics, codes of conduct, moral intuitions, moral sentiments, and then we codify that ultimately into rule of law, right? Or we try to, at least. So there's like this sort of religious, ethical substrate to being human that then gets codified into our legal and political systems. And so that all of that data, I guess, is contained in a lot of these great stories, right? And that's why on the West, right, it starts with the King James Bible, and then we have these other great books. But that, if the individual human mind, like we're running some type of cognitive software, right? It's as if we are we are dependent on, or at least interactive with, that external hard drive, which are the collections of these books, right? That make us who we are in a way, right? Like, we are literally programmed by these stories, whether we read them directly or whether just indirectly, right? If they're just codified in the legal systems, and those incentives or disincentives govern how we act. So there's like a very deep computational relationship. And it's fascinating to me too that we didn't really have a metaphor for this until recently. And it might not be exactly perfect, but I think it's better than anything we've ever had previously.
Yeah. And maybe another way of saying what you just said is by reading these great books, you're able to recognize things that are fixed to actually be malleable.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is, let's take the example you gave about some of our ethical norms, about thou shalt not kill, of the elevation of compassion. You might look around today and you see, well, not only Christian cultures have this, but in East Asia, the Buddhist cultures also emphasize this. This must be like the right set of morals, right? And everything else is kind of a perversion. But if you really study these great books, you realize that it's like a software update. Something happened 2,000 years ago in the West where the values genuinely went from the Greek values. I mean, think Achilles. He doesn't care about compassion. He doesn't even care about helping his fellow Greeks. He wants his own glory. It went from that type of a gentle power worshipping kind of culture, kind of firmware, right? I think that's a great analogy. To the kind of Christian compassion-driven culture we have today. And in fact, this is the topic of one of the first books that I'm doing, and the lecture should be out by the time we release this episode. One of Nietzsche's most important books called The Genealogy of Morality, where he tries to answer this question: where do our moral system come from? And so I think another way to bring it back to why read the great books is, before you read these texts, you might think the world is a lot more solid than it actually is. And the reason you think that is because these different layers, right, to continue the software analogy, they update in different cycles, right? An app might receive an update once every few weeks. The firmware once every few months, but you're not going to get a new MacBook until a few years, right? And so maybe the human hardware is the biology, and then the firmware are these myths and these stories and these foundational moral intuitions that don't get updated for millennia. And then on top of them, you have ideas like, I don't know, GDP, like Bitcoin, like infrastructure, like democracy, and then you have high level ideas. So one way to understand of why you should delve into the great books is that it allows you to go deeper and deeper into the human OS. Yeah,
that's a great way to look at it, and it's also a good framing for understanding how interpenetrating we are with our technologies, right? There's the old saying that, Churchill said something like, we make our buildings and then our buildings make us. And, it's been generalized like we make our tools and then our tools make us. But we are participants in a co-evolutionary process, right? That as we make new tools, write new books, do new things, like we literally change the path of our evolutionary trajectory. And one last thing I think is really important about the literature, great literature in particular, is it's often described as fiction, and fiction is typically understood as untruth, right? Like someone just made this stuff up. So when people say like, oh, I don't read fiction, I like to learn real stuff. It's like, well, hold up. The fiction is more like a distillation of many, many, many stories, right? You're taking the essence of maybe general patterns that have been observed across many particular instances of human interaction, and they get distilled into these, quote unquote myths or pieces of literature that are not maybe true in the sense that it's a narrative documentation of something that actually happened, but it is a distillation of many, many, many things that have actually happened. So as Peterson describes this, he said, it's not necessarily that they're not real. It's more like these stories are hyper real in the same way that numbers are hyper real, right? Numbers don't actually exist anywhere, but as a system of categorization, it's almost universal in its applicability. Whereas these, great stories, that's why they're great, because they tell deep fundamental truths about what it's like to be human. And that I think is just sorely overlooked. And as you said, people looking down on the humanities, like that's a problem.
Right. And there's something to add on to that, which is not only are they a distillation so that their truth value is heightened, but they're often a more effective vessel for delivering those ideas.
That's right.
Because it's like, I don't know, like reading philosophy, many people have the experience of this, is like eating cardboard.
Yes.
Right. But sometimes listening to a nice story is just like downing, I don't know, pick your favorite dessert. Right.
Yes.
And so, I think we should ask ourselves, like, how many Romans died for their country because they, read Cicero really closely, because they read the Stoics?
Right.
I bet it would be at least one magnitude less than the amount of Roman soldiers who read Virgil's Aeneid, right, which is this founding story of the Roman Empire in this case, and was motivated to imitate Aeneas. Yeah. And so that actually brings into one of the key observations of all the thinkers that I'm really interested in, is that humans are imitative creatures and not as rational as we think them to be. It's not that humans can't behave rationally, but it's that, especially in modernity, we emphasize how rational humans are, and we underestimate how imitative they are. But again, that is part of the modern firmware. It wasn't always like that. We did live in a world where people were treated fundamentally not as rational creatures, but as imitative social creatures. That's right. So again, that's something that's new, but that's been developed.
Yes. No, that's an excellent point. So yeah, this is what a bone that I have to pick is this whole idea that we have identified the word myth with untruth in the West. And it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Myth is, as you said, it's one of these primary, and I'm using myth here as kind of like just mythology, which I'll put literature as a subset of that. You know, like literature sort of becomes mythology over time.
Motivating stories, right? Yeah. Motivating stories.
I was going to say, it's a prime motivational system, right? Like people read these stories of great heroes and they actually start to imitate them, right? Even through the story. You don't actually have to you don't need to have interacted with Jesus of Nazareth to imitate Jesus of Nazareth, just through the stories that have been told about him. It's also a phenomenal data compression technology, as we've said, right? Where you take this distilled memory of human action, right? And you abstract out the essence, the moral essence of like, what did we learn from all of this? And you get all of that compressed into this very palatable narrative, as you said, right? And versus reading analytical philosophy is like eating cardboard. If you're not going to absorb it, then like, what's the point, right? It needs to be a enjoyable container to get people to absorb it, frankly. So I think myth just sort of meets all of these requirements. And then I mean, one last analogy, I guess, for this is it almost starts to feel to me like an owner's manual for being human, right? It's like you're looking at, as you said, the human OS or the human source code. And you're like, oh, how did we end up with all of these cultural, moral presuppositions? It's like, well, don't kill, don't steal, all these other things. It's like, well, these are the stories that tell you, like, if you don't do that, well, here's what happens. And people that have tried other things, here were the results. And so it's a very useful way of looking at yourself at a most basic level, not just yourself, but human beings in general. So with that, you mentioned a thinker who we talked about last time. That's one of your favorite authors. And I guess he's the one that originated this idea that humans are highly imitative creatures, although wasn't the first one to think that. I think he quotes Aristotle in the opening pages of his book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, who said something like, I'm paraphrasing, that man excels all the other animals in his ability to imitate. And that author that I'm referring to here is Rene Girard. So that book was just simply mind-blowing. I was sharing it with you offline. I read it a couple of years ago. We had a short series on it. I talked to a few people about it, and I found it to be one of those books that's fundamentally re-architected my worldview. And I find Mimetic Desire peeking its head out in just the strangest areas of my life. Like you see in interpersonal interactions, you see people getting motivated by, well, frankly, I'll use the word jealousy, frankly. And I want to talk about this because I was having a conversation with my girlfriend, and she was sharing, she was a little bit older than her two younger sisters, about 7 years older. So she was kind of a semi-maternal figure to them because she was much older. And she had to go through this process of educating them about the dangers of jealousy and how it can sabotage relationships between sisters and relationships between, female friends more generally. And we started digging into that, and that's my spidey sense started going off about mimetic desire, because it sounded like a lot of the things I'd read in the book. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to look into the etymology of the word jealousy, because it seemed like such a primary motivational thing and something that people deal with a lot. And that's when my mind was really blown, because Rene Girard talked about mimetic desire, which can lead to or is a component of jealousy, being the reason, or being a precursor to religion itself. And when I looked at the etymology of the word jealousy, I found the word zeal, right? Like, as in, religious fanaticism or zealotry. And so I wanted to pick your brain about that. What is jealousy? What is zeal? How are these things related under the canopy of mimetic desire?
So zeal, when we use it now, I think just means pursuing something with great passion or energy. And it has a slightly positive connotation, right? Maybe that's why you were so shocked, because we tend to think about jealousy as a bad thing.
It can be negative too, though, right? When they say someone's a zealot, I think that's kind of a negative connotation.
Exactly, yeah. But zeal by itself, I think, is slightly more, Now, if you look at Aristotle's treatment of zeal, I think this was in his poetic, I don't know, but in Aristotle's treatment of zeal, I forget where it's from, which book it's from, defined zeal as that sense of lack you feel when you see someone of a similar ability to you, or similar to you in some regard, achieve something greater than you, that you also think you can achieve. Now, obviously, that's like a word-for-word definition of mimetic desire in some sense, right?
Yes.
But Aristotle has one important qualification here. For Aristotle, zeal, again, is a slightly more positive, it's certainly a lot more positive than Girard's treatment of zeal. And one of Aristotle's qualifications is that it's a good thing. So it's not like you see someone who robs a bigger bank than you.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's, you see someone who is more athletic than you, who has read more great books than you, and you are jealous there, and that zeal motivates you to do that. And the very fact that is defined as somewhat of a positive motivational force, again, goes back to one thing in our early conversation, which is that we used to view humans as social creatures. And so this idea that you would want to do something because other people do it would just be a fact. It wouldn't be like a bad thing. It wouldn't be, I mean, when you talk to people, I'm sure you have in the last few months, about mimetic desire, what do people want to say? They want to say, well, I'm not mimetic, right? Well, I'm an individual. I'm rational. But that's kind of a naive way, I think, of reading Girard, because what Girard is saying is that you're so deep into this. Like, it's impossible to think about humans as being non-mimetic, as it's impossible to think of a triangle as not having three sides.
That's right.
Picture a four-sided triangle. I have no idea what that looks like, right? And so Aristotle's treatment of zeal is quite positive, right? And that's actually, I'm not a biblical scholar here, but one of the ways I've heard that famous commandment of the Ten Commandments being interpreted. So when God in the Old Testament says, have no gods before me, for I am a jealous God. That actually means like zealous God. I'm filled with zeal. I'm filled with positive sort of energy. So because if you interpret that passage as jealous, it doesn't really make that much sense, right? Like if he's omnipotent, like why is he jealous? Right. And so those are those are how those two concepts are created. And the mere fact that we want to dissociate with anything social in modernity already tells you that our rational understanding of man is I think deeply limited and flawed.
Yes, no, it's excellent. After reading this, I started to try and evaluate, like, where does this live in me? Like, where can I see instances of me being mimetic? And it took me a long time. I think we're almost wired to not be able to see this in ourselves or something, because
Girard says we hide it. Girard says we actively hide it from ourselves.
Yeah, it took me a very long time to try and get to it, but it was through this conversation that I mentioned with my girlfriend and a few other instances that I started to uncover it for myself. And I've been lifelong kind of fitness obsessed guy. And I was trying to reflect on, like, where does that come from? What have I been, like, obviously I played sports when I was young and whatnot, but I remember being, and it's still hard to even talk about today. It's like a confession. It feels weird, but it's not a big deal. It's like when I was a young kid, I was a little bit out of shape. I was like a chubby kid in, say, third grade. So like 8 years old. And I remember going to these pool parties, when you're just getting to that age where you kind of like are interested in girls and whatever, and it's getting competitive. And some of the kids would be like, lean at the pool.
Shredded, yeah.
Yeah. And then I'm like, not. And I was just like, I hated that feeling. Right. And so then that planted a seed, basically, that I think grew into my lifelong obsession with fitness.
But that's been positive, right?
But it's been positive. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the Aristotelian point here, which is that just because something is mimetic doesn't mean it's bad. The question is what? Like, what are you oriented to? And that's actually, you mentioned Things Hidden as one of the books that sort of blew your mind. And I share that experience. Things Hidden was my first book into philosophy. Not a great entry point for philosophy. I wouldn't wish it on my enemies.
Yeah.
But there are many, many books out there that have that ability to sort of blow your mind.
Yes.
And once you start reading them, you start to see that Girard is maybe not as unique in his observations as you might have initially thought.
Yeah.
I mean, one thinker that we're starting off with, we're launching with two thinkers, Rousseau and Nietzsche. Rousseau has this notion of amour propre. It's a French word, very difficult to understand, to translate, but essentially it's a desire for recognition. So it's deeply intertwined with this idea of mimetic desire.
Yes.
And initially you think desire for recognition is bad, right? I mean, what's that comment you hear in modernity?
Yeah.
Don't care what other people think.
Right.
Okay. That's not possible.
Right.
I had a friend in college who went around telling everyone that he didn't care what people thought of him.
Yeah.
But of course, if he really didn't care, he wouldn't have told people that.
That's right.
So what he was really saying was, I want you to think of me as someone who doesn't care what you think of me.
Yes.
And so there's all these different ways that this perversion of modernity can happen, where you try to convince yourself and others that you're not really mimetic. And so Rousseau also has very similar treatments to this idea of amour propre that Girard has to mimetic desire. And I'll mention one last thing, which is you gave an example of how amour propre or mimetic desire led you to a positive sphere. That's a large part of what Rousseau's project is about, which is how do we properly direct amour propre, right? That's not really covered in Girard. Girard is a lot more critical, as you know, right? It's a lot more diagnostic. It's a lot more critical. It's a lot more apocalyptic. But Rousseau really, starts from a lot of Girard's positions, but he has an ambitious, positive vision. What does a good society look like where amour propre or mimetic desire is positively directed? And what is a good example of lives that are positively directed? So let me just give you one example, okay, of how we can positively direct this in our lives. One idea that was actually taken on by Hegel, and Hegel took on and ran with it and became the famous master-slave dialectic, is that you should really only seek desire and recognition from people who you also respect.
Right.
So let me give you an example. If you're launching a podcast, if you desire the recognition of people who are, doom scrolling Twitter every day, Rousseau thinks that that's a much less healthier version than if you only desired to impress or be recognized by other podcasters that you really respect. And I think the intuition is quite obvious here. If you want to appeal to the doom scrollers, who do you have on, right? You have, Destiny or you have like the latest like fad on to talk about the most egregious concepts. But if what you're trying to do is impress other intellectual podcasters, then suddenly that recognition helps you maintain your standard. Just like how the desire of recognition from girls gives you more motivation to work out. That's also been a core motivation for me to work out as well. So, and I think that's true for most young men. And so Rousseau's project is about, and people can listen to the lectures if they want to find out more, is about how we properly direct this drive, right? And so again, this is just we're just beginning in the Western canon. There's so much more to explore.
No, that's so good. And it's another thing that's coming up for me here is I guess I'm always, probably like yourself, I've always been philosophically inclined, but my experience is that interacting with most people in the world, that it's a pretty rare inequality. I mean, it's not, most people aren't like that, right? Like most people seem to be a little bit more into, whatever, sports, whatever the general things that people are into. And so my friends had always kind of made fun of me, like, you're not really into small talk, are you? Like you're always asking these big questions and what have you. And I think that somehow cultivated maybe like a shyness or even a fear in me to really be, just like openly talk to someone about things I want to talk about, which are often these deep questions, philosophical ponderings and whatnot. But when Jordan Peterson was having his moment, this Jordan Peterson effect, there was definitely something there. Like not only was he speaking, he was sharing a message that I resonated with a lot, like some stuff I was going with. It was helpful to me, like it was for millions of men all over the world, right? Take responsibility, tell the truth, etc. But it was also his willingness to just speak openly and philosophize openly, like speak his mind very clearly, that almost like gave me permission or gave me the courage.
A model. He was a model for you.
He was a model. Right. He was a model, a mimetic model that really encouraged me to, and it was actually what he said about podcasting too. He said, for the first time in history, bandwidth is basically free. And so now the spoken word could establish the reach and permanence of the written word. So it was going to be a technological revolution. And so it was kind of that assessment of the technology coupled with his own work that really inspired me to kind of like start the podcast. And in a way, I guess I'm imitating the model, right?
Right.
And when I finally had him on the podcast, it was like such a milestone. It was like, I was, I don't know, starstruck, but I was like I felt very motivated to impress and do it right. And, all of that. And all of that, I think you could just boil down to mimetic desire in a way.
Right. But a very, very positive, again, a very positive species of it, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever wanted to live in an off-grid community with complete food, energy, and water independence? If so, then you need to check out the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a pioneering community designed to foster longevity and well-being, eliminating elements that detract from these goals. At the farm, the convergence of nature, nutritious food, a supportive community, and the ethos of slowing down is unparalleled. Positioned at the gateway to the UNESCO World Heritage-nominated Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, the farm at Okefenokee stands as a testament to a lifestyle that truly nurtures health and happiness. Unlike conventional housing developments where a token communal garden may suffice, the farm itself is the community. Small, intimate micro-villages seamlessly integrate into the fabric of a sprawling agricultural community. So if you're interested in joining this off-grid community, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about becoming a member. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on their custom cabin pricing. Again, go to okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. I'd like to thank my friends at Swan Bitcoin for their long-standing support of the What is Money show. Swan's mission is to help millions of people get into Bitcoin, so they built the best solution to set up recurring Bitcoin buys and automatic withdrawals into cold storage. With the Swan app, it takes just 2 minutes to sign up and start buying Bitcoin. If you're a new customer, you get $10 in free Bitcoin for signing up, and the first $10,000 of Bitcoin you buy incurs 0 fees. If you're an existing Swan customer, then the next $10,000 of Bitcoin you buy now incurs 0 fees. So if you love to recommend Bitcoin to friends and family, then Swan is the best place to start. So go to swanbitcoin.com/breedlove to get started today. Again, that's swanbitcoin.com/breedlove.
Another thing I was thinking about this too is that I want to ask you about this because, again, it's universal, it's ubiquitous, so you can't say it's just bad or just good, right? It's like saying that, gosh, what's
breathing is bad, right?
Yeah,
breathing
like
is
sound waves are bad or good. Something that's like almost amoral, right? It's like gravity is bad or good. It's just it's just a principle of our reality, basically. So it's not, you can't assign a moral quality to it per se. But I was thinking about this again, back to the jealousy conversation with my girlfriend. She was saying, well, I thought about it like this. It's like, if you imagine, say there's a woman that sees the perfect marriage, right? That she's a single woman and she sees the perfect married couple. It's the husband she wished she had. It's the woman she wished she was. It's the kids she wished she had, the career, the car, the house, whatever the things are. And you would think, oh, well, that woman's probably jealous, right? But if that single woman approached that married couple and said, you know what? You two are so lovely. I think you're so beautiful together. Your husband's so handsome. Your wife's so beautiful. Your children are great. You seem to be really in love. I just think it's wonderful. I really appreciate witnessing the love you two have and the life you have. You can almost, like, through her act of honesty or confession, you like convert that jealousy into just a really powerful compliment. And then there's nothing for her to like internalize and fester about, So it's like, something occurred to me there. I was like, oh, maybe this is why people are encouraged to confess their sins, right? It's like you can treat that natural mimetic reality with some honesty or some radical truth, and all of a sudden you can neutralize the
right.
potentially corrosive effects of jealousy itself. So I'm wondering what you think about the relationship between maybe honesty and jealousy or zeal.
Well, I think you're on you're if you were a truffle dog, I'd give you a pat because you're on the money here. You're on a very crucial insight here. Girard said that mimetic desire, even when it's bad, is essentially good because it's fundamental openness.
Right.
If you think about what enables mimetic desire, it's our ability to reach into the subjectivity of others. Right. Yes. It's me to experience what you living in Miami could be like, and that might inspire jealousy. And so that fundamental pathway, I think Girard thinks is, if not unique in humans, is certainly heightened in humans, is also the pathway of compassion.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because when I see you suffering and I imitate that,
right, that's
what makes me want to help you as if you were me.
Yeah.
So Girard thinks that this is a very, very beautiful, beautiful thing that makes, again, to your point, humans what they are. It's like gravity. It's just there. And so you're exactly on the money here, where this can be a positive social thing as well. And so we may say that in the human world, sociality can be higher and lower than animals, right?
Right.
You don't have animals destroying their own dams to try to spite someone else, right? A zero-sum thing.
Yeah. But
you also don't really have like global aid, right? Animals helping other animals that they can't see, like storing acorns for that doesn't happen either. So the human world is both a lot better and a lot worse because of this.
Yeah.
And let me just push this even further. Rousseau, there's an argument in Rousseau that even reason itself is not possible without our ability to imitate, our ability to mimesis. Okay, the question is, why is that? Well, if you think about what reason is, it's the ability to step out of our immediate, animalistic set of desires. right? I'm able to say, I see a hamburger on the street and I'm hungry. And reason is able to say, well, no, but let's think where it's been, or let's think maybe it's someone else's hamburger.
Right.
Dogs probably aren't able to do that. Like,
Right.
and if they can control themselves, it's not through that mechanism, right? That they're able to think logically. However, that pathway of being able to step out of my own frame into another frame, what does that sound like? That's mimesis, right?
Yes.
In the same way, I might say, look, if I just jumped over on that car like a dog and ate a hamburger on the street, what is Robert going to think of me, right? Mimetic Desire,
Yes,
I'm all pro.
Of course.
That's a similar, it's not the exact same, but it's a similar pathway that reason also uses.
Yeah.
So that's also a very interesting argument that without this pathway of mimesis, that even reason itself would not have been possible in some strong sense. And so,
That's fantastic. And that goes back to the importance of the great books, right? Is that you can actually internalize these figures from these books, right? Like there were these bracelets when I was a kid, people would often wear WWJD, what would Jesus do, right? It was like encouraging people to ask themselves in every action, how would Jesus do this? So they're internalizing that model of being effectively. And that idea, you said mimetic desire is based on this ability to internalize one another. That's essential, obviously, to empathy, to compassion,
to language, right?
To language, to maturity. They say this is actually from Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke. They say this is how children mature, is that they internalize a model of their parents and other people. So whereas the 2-year-old might just go into the cookie jar, right? Maybe the 5-year-old would say, you know what, before they go into the cookie jar, they've internalized mom telling them not to, right? And so they don't do it. They're self-restrained. And so that is, our ability to internalize other people is bound up with our process of maturity. And it reminds me of this great quote too, that I forget who this was. It was a very successful naval captain. He said the job of the captain is to see his ship through the eyes of the crew, right? Like to really run the thing effectively. The captain can't be everywhere at once, but he needs to internalize the model of his best people. So he's like the distributed central commander of that ship, right? He's not doing everything, but he's the boss, so to speak. So it's this ability, right? This unique ability humans have to, one other thing too, evil, I think, comes up here, right? Because if you can reflect upon, if you can use your self-consciousness to decide something that can really hurt you, right? I know doing this would really hurt me. You can then use that to inflict that onto someone else. So it's not morally bad or good. It's like a tool, basically, and it can be used for destructive or constructive purposes. And I wonder, another thing I want to ask you about here, I think it was Tesla said, if you want to understand the universe, you have to learn how to think in terms of frequency, energy, and vibration. And there's this concept in physics, I don't know if you're familiar with it, called entrainment. And it's anytime you put one vibrational body near another vibrational body, that eventually those two patterns start to harmonize, right? Like they're mutually influential, and eventually the patterns start to synchronize or harmonize. And so, we know that obviously when women spend time together, their menstrual cycles start to harmonize. When married couples have been together for a long time, they start to look like each other and finish each other's sentences. There's even that thing, people say people start to look like their pets and vice versa. I wonder if mimetics is to human interaction what entrainment is to physics. Like we are vibrational creatures. And so you put us in the same area together and we start to reflect one another, or it doesn't have to be, again, physical space. It could also be cognitive space, right? Like you can read the stories of great people and you can start to internalize their operating system, if you will. So I wonder what you think about that.
Exactly right. I think that's exactly right on two fronts. The first is on the specific content of what human nature consists in. And it's this, as you described it, vibrational character. But also, I really like the way that you're conceiving of human nature as if it were physics, as if there were laws of human nature. Right. And that's not something that all these great books assume. But I would say most of them make some kind of claim like that. that human reason can veer into human nature and identify the laws of the soul. So instead of laws of physics. And for me, coming from a STEM background, now I find the laws of the human soul a lot more interesting than the laws of galaxies far, far away, because it's a lot more practical. It's about me. And so one example here is, Rousseau infamously says in his second discourse, which we did a lecture on, and it's going to be live in a few weeks, that the second discourse is an inquiry into where inequality comes from. And in order to do this, Rousseau seemingly gives us a historical argument, but then he says something like, okay, before we begin, let's set aside all the facts. Okay, let's close all the scientific books. And so you're like, what the hell is going on? Is he out of his mind? And the answer is no, because what Rousseau is giving you there is a thought experiment. What Rousseau wants to tease out aren't the exact historical developments of inequality in this and that nation, but it's about the principles behind how inequality forms. And so this is why Immanuel Kant would call Rousseau, or one of the reasons why he would call Rousseau the Newton of the moral world. That much like Newton, he's uncovered these fundamental laws of human nature, and amour propre, this is desire for recognition, or what very closely what Girard called mimetic desire, is one of those laws.
Wow. It's really interesting stuff to look at that way, and it definitely it just kind of forces you to pull back the layers on your own humanity and look at yourself with a more objective, I guess, view, rather than, it's very easy to be like, oh no, I'm not jealous, I don't imitate this, but it's I think if you examine yourself long enough and close enough, you'll find many instances of it in life.
But the good thing is, the positive side of the story is, and we've been developing this idea together already, finding these things in your life is probably step one. Realizing that they're not always bad is probably step two.
Yes.
That our culture just calls certain things bad that aren't totally bad, and calls certain things good that aren't always good.
That's right.
And then part three is probably understanding how to direct those things so that they can become good and minimize the bad. So these ideas, so that's probably the sort of like process, right, of reading these books.
And it reinforced, again, the whole idea of confessing jealousy, turns it into, like, it just neutralizes the harmful effects of it. It reinforced the importance of radical truth for me. It's like, oh, telling the truth, quote unquote, confessing your sins really does let you redeem yourself in a way. In a more psychological sense than a theological sense. Okay, I want to jump into some of this. There's several points that you cover, obviously, in your new series. Do you call it a series, or it's a lecture?
Series. There's both lectures and interviews, so I'm just
got it.
Series, yeah.
So, and we set aside a few points here we wanted to talk about. And maybe some of this ties into mimetic desire. I'm not entirely sure. I'll lean on you for that. But you talk about the idea of achievement, and why so many successful people are assholes. And this, I guess this does seem to be. I'm immediately thinking of Steve Jobs, right? Where it's like one of the most impactful entrepreneurs, if not the most impactful entrepreneur in the history of the human race. But when you hear about stories from people who worked closely to him, he was notoriously kind of an asshole, hard to work with or work for. So what's going on there? What's the relationship between high achievement and being an asshole?
Right. So this is covered in, again, Nietzsche's sort of famous book, Genealogy of Morality, where, again, he's trying to show you the origins of where our moral system comes from. But the project is a bit more than that. It's a critical project. He wants you to convince you to get rid of our current moral scheme. He almost wants to convince you, not exactly, but as approximation of going back to that sort of Greco-Roman world that sort of shamelessly worships and idolizes power and strength and wealth and beauty. And so, what he's getting you to, what he wants to, let me rephrase that. In that book, what Nietzsche wants to liberate you from is things like compassion, is things like helping others, is things like moderation. And instead, he wants you to embrace your natural desires he wants you to be okay with your own suffering, right? Instead of chasing happiness. That's the goal of modernity, right? And he also wants you to be okay about using other people as mere tools for your own end. And when you first read that, you're like, he's out of his mind, right? Like, this can't be. On what possible grounds could Nietzsche sort of advocate for this type of revaluation of values?
Yeah.
And Nietzsche's answer is that in order to create what he called higher men, creative geniuses, great men, and maybe Steve Jobs is one of them, those are the values that are most conducive to these people. And the reason of why so many high-achieving people are assholes, why people have great projects are assholes, it's kind of a tautology. It's because they care so much about their great project and their work that everything is in service of this. Okay.
Right.
And so one example that one of the top Nietzsche scholars whom I interviewed gave was Beethoven. Okay.
Yes.
So Beethoven nominally was a Christian, but this man did not live a Christian life. He didn't dedicate, it wasn't out of a love for God. It wasn't out of a desire to capture the beauty of the universe that he created his music, right? He treated it as Achilles treated his glory, as the way for himself to live eternally. And there are quotes from his biography where he says things like, you know, I value my friends only for what they can do for me as a musician, where they're like mere instruments, literally, for his own end. And the kind of what Nietzsche's trying to get you to see, right? We talked about how things like jealousy, which we think are always bad, sometimes can be good. Nietzsche also wants to do, Nietzsche here's giving another example here, where there's certain things that we think are good, like compassion, like meekness. He wants to show you that it can be deeply limiting for a certain type of person, right? And so that's the key insight. The key insight is people are always quite upset when they find out that their heroes, whether it was an athlete or a great entrepreneur or a great writer, is an asshole. And I think Nietzsche wants to show you that that's much more part of the course. And it's really the exception when high-achieving people are nice, right? That's when you really got to do a double take. Because part of what it means to dedicate your entire life to a great project is to dedicate your entire life and all your relationships instrumentally in pursuit of that great project, right? And so that's one of the key insights. And you know, perhaps what Nietzsche certainly wants to motivate people to do is he wants to create the right type of cultural conditions to create these higher men, to produce more Steve Jobs. And he doesn't think, you know, giving out participation trophies and you know, telling people to be nice to each other and to be tolerant of others. He doesn't think that's the type of cultural environment. And if you look at where culture right now in America is the most vivacious, it is those type of brutal sort of agonistic cultures, right? In startup world, startups are effective because they're dictatorships, right? In athletes, right? Think about athletics, like that's like probably one of the least passionate, at least when they're on the field, type of endeavors. You can actively advertise in athletics that you want to destroy your rivals in a way that you can't in any other sphere, right? And so that's what Nietzsche wants to make you see.
Yeah, that is fascinating. There's kind of a paradox here that some of these quote unquote assholes, I mean, the people that are calling them assholes are those that are local to them, right? That are interacting with them in a, you know, interpersonal way across some span of time, either as their friend or as their employee or whatever it may be. But many of those quote unquote assholes end up serving some of the highest ends of humanity, right? Like in terms of creating, well, who you mentioned, was it Beethoven or Mozart? Beethoven,
yeah.
Right. He wrote some of the greatest music ever, you know, most celebrated music. Steve Jobs obviously created one of the most valuable companies in the world. And so it's like, okay, maybe the humans that are proximate to them consider them to be assholes, but then the humans that are not proximate to them all celebrate them for a really, really long time. So, and that just seems like kind of a paradox in a way.
And this paradox runs even deeper, not Nietzsche, but Rousseau now, because for Rousseau, one of the most important archetypes in the community are heroes. Right? Think about someone like Achilles, not just because of what heroes do for their community, in Achilles' case, helping push the Trojans back, but as the example you gave, because they create models for other people to emulate. So it's not, the hero is important not just because of what the hero himself does, but because of the amount of people that are become more virtuous because through imitating the hero. That's second order effect. Here's the paradox, and it links with exactly what you just described. Heroes who help community the most, for Rousseau, don't care about the community.
Wow.
Why do they help the community? For their own glory.
Oh.
And if you think about what was Achilles motivated by? It was his own glory, right?
Yeah.
And again, when you look throughout history of the great men, of people like Steve Jobs, I mean, these people are in it for themselves. Now, it's a sort of more grandiose selfishness, right? That I want to do this great project.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, it's I want to do this great project. I mean, there's that famous line of Elon Musk's biographer, which is that Elon wants to save the world, but only if he's the one doing it. Right.
Right.
And so that's the insight that Rousseau is trying to draw out, that some of the most selfish people in the community, when their selfishness is directed in the right way, is actually deeply beneficial for the community at large. And so again, I think if you agree with Nietzsche and Rousseau's reasoning here, what this means is we probably shouldn't. First of all, we should be more encouraging, or at least more tolerant of those asshole-like behaviors. If they're exhibited by the right kind of person, right? If you're like incompetent and an asshole, you're probably not. You're probably just going to be an asshole,
right? Yeah.
But that is the type of culture that Nietzsche at least, not Rousseau for very different reasons, Nietzsche wants to sort of cultivate there.
Yeah.
And I think he also wants to remind us that, things aren't always Disney movies where people who want to help humanity are the ones who actually do. Humanity often progresses through these much darker desires that people don't want to speak about.
That's a great point. And I feel like this sort of reinforces libertarianism in a way. Like, it's okay under the philosophy of libertarianism, it's okay to be an asshole as long as you don't violate the life, liberty, or property of anyone else, right? That's where that assholeness goes too far. But, if you're not nice, or you're maybe even, I hesitate to say this because I really believe radical truth is important, but, Rothbard says it's okay to lie because you're not violating your property. There's stories.
Elon lies all the time about his delivery times, right? Steve Jobs has a reality distortion field, right? Which is a nice way of saying what you're saying right now. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Steve Jobs, I remember in his documentary that he lied to his co-founder. Like, when they got their first check, he told them it was like 20% as much of what it was, and he kept the difference. So, like, it seems like, that's a tough one, man. That's a tough one. Because you don't want to condone that, right? It doesn't seem ethical. But then you're like, well, fuck, he's Steve Jobs. Look what he did. So that's a strange one.
So what I think maybe to help you resolve the tension here, Nietzsche is famously inegalitarian. So, right. So he does not believe that humans are equal in the way that we think. He believes that there are higher men and there are the herd. And the higher men are born to be higher men. They're born with sort of noble aristocratic natures. Now, these natures, I mean, the proper analogy should be like gardening a tree. Yeah. They need the right type of cultural environment there, right? So, i.e., if you put a higher man into a, I don't know, culture that's all super tolerant, super nice, they're gonna get messed up because there's no sunlight, there's no water. Gotcha. But there's nothing you could do to what he calls the herd. You can't turn a tomato plant into an oak tree, no matter how much sunlight you give him. And that's how big of a difference that Nietzsche thinks exists between humans. That some people, for certain people, lying makes their greatness greater. For others, like if you feed meat to a lion, it'll make him stronger. If you feed meat to a lamb, it's going to kill the lamb, right? At a certain point. Right. And that's and so Nietzsche's inegalitarianism helps him resolve this tension that you're highlighting, which is that for some people it elevates them, these sort of asshole-like behaviors. But for I'll pause there.
Wow, that's a lot to reflect on. I've only read one. I've read one of Nietzsche's books, Beyond Good and Evil, and I read one book about Nietzsche, which was War Speak. I thought was really good, actually. And I didn't realize that the term "the sovereign individual" was actually coined by Nietzsche.
Yep. Genealogy of Morals. He used it only once in his entire corpus, but it was in the Genealogy of Morals. Yeah.
Yes. Is that equivalent to the Ubermensch? And is the Ubermensch then is an asshole? I would assume, right?
So first of all, I'm not well read in the sovereign individual literature.
Yeah.
What Nietzsche says is that for him, you have sort of natural man, and then natural man has society imposed upon him. So you can think of like external laws imposed on him. But the sovereign individual is someone who sort of pushes through that, who has so many laws imposed upon him, or rather that he imposes it on himself, that he again becomes independent, but in a very radically different way that the initial natural man is. Now, that shares a similar shape, the Ubermensch, right? The Ubermensch for Nietzsche is not just a return to the Greek ideals, but it's certainly not just staying what we are in modernity, which he considers the last men, right? So in that, I think they share a similar form, but I don't know. Yeah, I can't really answer that question of whether they're the exact same. But what I will say is that the Ubermensch for Nietzsche is definitely maybe not immoral, but he's amoral. He operates beyond good and evil. He's not as concerned with these Western ideals, these Christian or even Buddhist ideals of compassion as the primary thing, right? I mean, think about how odd that is. When we ask, is someone a good person? We initially think, are they compassionate or not? But that's just one of the virtues, right? That's like one of many virtues. But so it's quite weird that that is the primary thing we think about, and that's what Nietzsche's trying to get us to see.
Would he be? I mean, surely there's got to be some line for Nietzsche, right? Would he advocate for killing and stealing? Do you think?
He says in one of his books that Untimely Meditations that history proceeds through brains, like dead brains. History proceeds through bodies.
Wow.
You have to understand that Nietzsche's sole aim for the human race is not flourishing of all. It's not the, it's not protecting the fundamental interests or the basic interests, what a libertarian would want to do. For him, it's the production of great men, of higher men. And he thinks that aesthetically, higher men sort of redeem all of humanity. That the fact that Greek culture produced Sophocles alone redeemed all of Greece, that they were such a great culture. Now, most of us probably don't share that extreme view, but that's where Nietzsche's really coming from. And that's why he's okay advocating for things that people don't think is okay. But I think you do see how the more limited version of that, right, where this idea of like Steve Jobs being an asshole while operating within this libertarian framework, that is palatable even to us.
Yeah, that one I can like sort of get behind, but once you start institutionalizing or even being tolerant of killing or stealing, then the social fabric just comes unbound, basically, right?
Right.
What is Rand has a line where she says, when force becomes the standard by which men deal with one another, then the murderer wins out over the pickpocket, and that society vanishes in a spread of ruins and slaughter. It's like once, stealing and killing is not punished or not disincentivized, well, then people start to do it more and more and more and more and more. And before you know it, there's no sociality left. So it's like I kind of agree with Nietzsche to an extent, but there's got to be a line, right? We have to have some ethical line that we need to adhere to get society to maintain itself as a society.
I don't think I can give you a fully satisfying answer, but maybe one thing to highlight is when Nietzsche talks about higher men, he doesn't use the word great men, he uses higher men. Sometimes he refers to people like Napoleon, but he mostly has Shakespeare, Beethoven, and being somewhat of a narcissist himself in mind. And so once you start seeing that type of creation as what Nietzsche wants, I think it's more reasonable to loop in these ethical protections, right? You can't. Beethoven's not going to be educated in anarchy,
right?
So yeah.
Interesting.
Are you sick of being robbed by politicians through inflation and endless money printing?
If so, you need to be at Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville, Tennessee on July 25th through 27th. As the largest Bitcoin and Fintech conference in the world, Bitcoin 2024 stands as a beacon of monetary freedom, a glimmer of hope amongst a darkening macroeconomic backdrop. Top speakers, companies, and thought leaders from across the industry will convene in Nashville to look ahead to the next year and beyond. I will be there, and Bitcoin conferences like this have become my favorite place to socialize since becoming a Bitcoiner. Ticket prices will increase soon. Get your tickets now and secure your spot at this game-changing event. So go to b.tc/conference and use discount code Breedlove to sign up for the Bitcoin 2024 conference. Again, that's b.tc/conference, discount code Breedlove.
Over the past 9 years, I've been going through a pretty serious struggle with my personal health. It started with a sharp pain and stiffness in my hip after a lifting injury, which I later learned was related to some pretty extensive inflammation in my gut. Then I developed an autoimmune issue, and soon I was having joint pain all over, skin irritations, and all kinds of digestive issues. I visited many doctors trying to figure out what was wrong, but none of them were able to help me fix any of my issues. I eventually started to see an energy healer with whom I had some limited success, but it wasn't until I started working with the biohacker Anthony DiClementi last year that I was finally able to start making real progress on my healing journey. Anthony spent a lot of time with me learning about my specific situation and worked with me to adapt a custom health plan to address my needs. Anthony has served as a personal biohacker for celebrities, billionaires, and professional athletes all over the world. Besides helping people like me overcome health issues, Anthony and his world-class medical team also help guys that just want to optimize their cognitive performance, guys that want to pack on some muscle, and guys that just want to get shredded. Anthony keeps a tight book of business and is selective about the clients he brings on. To apply for Anthony's biohacking services, text Breedlove to 847-943-7221. Again, to apply for Anthony's biohacking services, just text Breedlove to 847-943-7221.
So, on the topic of Nietzsche, and I guess this gets into the political sphere, I assume Nietzsche would be pretty anti-woke, given his views on tolerance and excessively tolerant cultures. What would Nietzsche's critique of victimhood culture be, in your opinion?
So this also ties into his famous genealogy of morality, is one of his most important books. So like you said, he wouldn't be a big fan, I think, of modern victimhood culture, which you think would align him with the modern right, but for a reason that's very much against the other pillar of the modern right, which is Christianity. For Nietzsche, the origin of victimhood culture is Christian, is the Judeo-Christian system. And I think Nietzsche wants to ask you, or he wants to claim that let's look at who Christianity was by, for, and about. And let's look at who the Greco-Roman myths were by, for, and about. And for Nietzsche, Christianity is by victims, for victims, about victims, right? It was by initially the Jews who were persecuted. Then it was by the apostles who were even more persecuted. It's not about the victor, it's about the victim, right? It's about Joseph and not his brothers. It's about Moses and not the Pharaoh. It's about a carpenter whose defining moment is getting executed by the Roman state. And who is it for? Well, most of the early adopters of Christianity were the lower and middle classes, right? The Roman senatorial elite were the last to convert. Now, if you look at the Greco-Roman myths, right, think about Zeus and Poseidon, their world was often created by aristocratic poets. They were created often for aristocratic families, many of whom trace their lineage back to these myths. And of course, they were about the victor and not the victim. They were about these larger-than-life figures who could zap thunderbolts out of their fingertips. And Nietzsche's fundamental insight here is that the reason that our value system is the one that you opened this lecture with, this interview with, compassion, meekness, poverty, chastity, was because this was a value system made for the weak. In other words, the weak embraced these set of values because it was their way to get back at the strong. So let me give you maybe a personal example that I think you'll relate to. So when I was in college, I had a friend, a progressive friend, who I thought was the most moral person I'd ever met in my freshman year. Because every time I'd meet him, he'd talk about, protecting the weak, the poor, right, the oppressed, and all these governmental policies of socialism. Now, when he got older, he confessed to me, I still can't believe he did so, that his subscription towards socialism and things like that is not out of a love of the poor, but a hatred of the rich. So he had grown up in the middle class, and he was surrounded by upper middle class peers. And so money was the vector that always made himself feel bad.
Wow.
And so his turn against money was a way to get back at his peers. And so now he's not poor, the rich are evil.
Wow.
And that's what Nietzsche thinks is happening on a civilizational layer. He thinks that has been the last big firmware update, which is that the weak and the slaves got around together in the Judeo-Christian world and said, no, I'm not too ugly to get laid. I'm chaste, okay? I'm not bad at making money. I have the virtue of poverty. And he reads this psychological idea of resentment into people. So let me give you another example. And this closely ties to this idea of jealousy, because what motivates this is jealousy in a really fundamental way. Robert, if you weren't, I assume, a high sort of will to power agential guy, one direction you could have taken when you saw yourself being fat and other people being shredded is to lean into body positivity, right? No, this is amoral. You're promoting bad sort of aesthetic ideals that are unhealthy.
I don't think I would have worked in Tennessee, but yes, I could have tried that.
You could have tried, yeah, exactly. Maybe in California.
Yeah.
And that is another example of when jealousy becomes bad jealousy or positive zeal, right? It depends on the person. If you are fundamentally, Nietzsche thinks, weak and incompetent, then the only way that you can, any way you can resolve your jealousy, if you don't do it through this open communication way you described, is to flip the values on its head. Now, if you're filled with agency and you're competent, then you can be zealous and have positive imitation. So you see why here he's very much against what he calls like the herd and for the higher man. Because again, jealousy is something that lends to a bad outcome in the herd, but it can lead to positive outcomes in the higher man.
This one's incredibly complex because I don't know that you can assign all of that to Christianity, actually. There's another book that I read. It was Inventing the Individual, and it talked about basically property rights in the pre-Christ world, right, before Christ, and how we eventually, as a result of Christ, we, through the martyrs and whatnot, that reformed the legal system after his death, in the centuries after his death, we changed from a legal system that was centered on the father as kind of like what they called the paterfamilias. So the father could do basically whatever he wanted. He owned all the property in the family. He could kill his children in broad daylight, and it was perfectly legal because he basically owned his family, So the father was a patriarch, right? An actual patriarchy. And then in the post-Christ world, we moved into a world that has the recognition of the individual as the primary legal and social unit rather than the family. And so we have individual private property rights. We have individual, identities and legal frameworks centered on the individual. And so the idea that the resentment inherent to socialism, which I agree with, right? I mean, maybe there's people that are intellectually confused if they don't understand how capitalism works and why socialism can't work, as Mises basically proved in his calculation problem. Maybe there are people that are duped by the propaganda of socialism that think it's actually a workable thing. But I think most socialists are like your friend, right? They're motivated by some jealousy of some kind to actually try and flip the value scale so that they can compete in a way that, or compete on a terrain that's more advantageous to their aims. So I agree with that, but to say that all comes from a Christian slave victim mentality, I'm not so sure about, because Christianity also gave us individual private property rights, which is, kind of like the religious ethical substrate of modern libertarianism. So I don't know that you can assign all that to Christianity.
Right. So Nietzsche, let me put it this way. He's not the most careful scholar.
Okay? Yeah, okay.
but what he lacks in sort of nuance, I think he himself recognizes that lack of care, and sometimes he purposely gives unfair caricatures to get his points across.
Got it.
And so, one clear example of refutation of Nietzsche is Girard in his Things Hidden.
Okay. Yes.
Because for Girard, the central insight of Christianity is also the victim.
Yes.
But for Girard, that's not a bad thing. In fact, that's the thing that makes Christianity right.
The revelation.
So exactly. So there's a lot of the revelation, the scapegoat mechanism.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different ways to take this, but maybe what we can do as a small conclusion to this point is that what Nietzsche wants to draw out is this psychological mechanism of resentment, which I'm sure that our listeners can identify in all different types of spheres. Some they may agree with, some they may disagree with. Yes. But that is a powerful drive that, much like mimetic desire, that is a law, I really think, of human nature.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And last thing on Nietzsche, I heard this secondhand through Peterson, but there's some, again, according to Peterson, at some point in Nietzsche's writing, Nietzsche said he himself philosophizes with a hammer, that he can say in one sentence what it takes other people an entire book to say. So the guy clearly has a little bit of, as you said, maybe some narcissism at play, and maybe that clouded. I think he's a brilliant writer, and I think he predicted the 20th century basically before it happened. Right? He said, "Here's what's going to happen. God is dead, and we're never going to find enough water to wash away all the blood." And basically predicting the bloodbath of the 20th century. And he was right. So, you got to give credit where credit is due, but I think there might be some of this overgeneralization stuff going on as well. Hard to criticize Nietzsche, by the way. I don't even know if I feel audacious doing that, but that's just how I see it. So let's do a kind of a pivot here into the topic of romance. As you have written it, there's an unintuitive issue with adultery in a world where birth control is available and there are no religious prohibitions on, I assume this means premarital sex.
On adultery.
On
right?
Adultery specifically.
Or rather, maybe I can help you flesh out the idea here.
Please.
Which is that, why is adultery such a big deal? In a world where, let's be honest, most people are atheists. So it's clearly not God telling him, right, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor. The other big reason was biology, paternity. If we want to maintain the integrity of the family, you can't be adulterous. But we solved that already. We solved that through not only contraceptives, but we also solved that through paternity tests, right? And so why is adultery still a big issue? And this is actually probably less big of a pivot than you initially might think, because it has to do with this idea of amour propre, Rousseau's idea of desire for recognition. And if Rousseau thinks that we desire different species of recognition. So we all desire, he thinks, both respect and esteem. So respect is the type of recognition you receive by just being human. So this would be, for example, having private property in the United States, or having your human rights recognized, or being able to vote as a citizen. Like it's not because you're a Robert that you get to vote. It's because you're a human, right, that you get to vote.
That's right.
Now, we also desire something else. That's not enough, right? If all you had was the recognition of the state in this very general sense, you're probably not going to be very satisfied. We also need something Rousseau calls esteem. And esteem is the recognition you receive because of your particular aspects. Okay, so that would be the recognition of like, Robert is a great podcaster. People not everyone receives that kind of recognition, right?
Sure.
And so because of this, Rousseau also thinks that many of us desire a very specific type of esteem, and that's to be the best, right? And I think anyone who's competitive will realize that drive, that whatever you want to do, you want to be the best. Now, here's the issue. Remember how I said that Rousseau is about creating positive solutions to the problem of amour propre? Well, a big issue is clearly we can't all be the best.
Sure. Right.
So it seems like there's no way to design society where we can all have this core desire of being the best, or at least common desire of being the best satisfied.
Yeah.
Here's Rousseau's solution, or one of his solutions. We can't all be the best for everyone, but through monogamy, we can all be the best for someone. Think about it like this. Romance, at least monogamous romance, is the most competitive domain in the world, even more than war.
Yeah.
If you're literally not the number one, you're zero.
Yeah.
That's why there are empirical studies where they would show single men a picture of beautiful women, and then they ask them to donate, and they would donate exorbitant amounts because they're locked into that competitive drive. So the intuition here is that romance is an extremely competitive domain where the winner is marked out as being the best. What someone settling down with you is implicitly saying, the recognition they're implicitly giving you is, you are the best for me. And Rousseau thinks that is a type of desire that is able to satisfy our desire to be the best. So let me give you another example. A lot of young entrepreneurs, their motivations for building companies are really for a romantic partner, that they want to prove themselves in some way. And so I think it's a really pivotal moment usually when people get married, because it often makes them a lot less motivated in their careers. Now, this could be a positive thing, right? Where they're a lot less vain and they focus on things they actually like. But oftentimes they're just deflated. Like I have many friends like this who are so motivated when they were single. And then when they have a romantic partner already saying, you are the best for me, that desire to be the best that was channeled into economics, or at least suddenly has a substitute that it can find and latch onto. Okay, so now that we developed this, that an important part of romance and the institution of monogamous marriage is to have citizens be able to satisfy their desires to be the best. That is one of the key issues that I think Rousseau sees with adultery. Because when you're cheating on someone, you're taking away this recognition from them, right? And so you see how this is not a theological concern. This is not a biological concern, but it's almost like a social recognitive self-conception, right? That's why when you get cheated on, it's a feeling of you being destroyed in some way because that recognition was being robbed from you, right? So that also ties into this idea of, again, sort of jealousy, recognition, amour propre, mimetic desire.
Wow, that's fascinating stuff. It reminded me, my mom used to say this thing to me as a kid. I don't even know why she would say it, but now as an adult, it makes sense that she's like, there's always going to be someone smarter, faster, stronger, taller, better looking, richer, like always. That's always going to be there. So like, you need to accept that. I don't know in what context. It would be context of maybe if I'd lost or didn't get the highest score on the test or whatever the thing was, if I lost, right? If I came in second or third or fourth or whatever, she would share that with me. And, at the time you're like, why would you say that? Like, what does that have to do with this, whatever? But now that I'm older, I'm like, oh yeah, it's a very big world, right? And if you're not first now, at some point you will not be first, right? Like even if you are Michael Jordan today, well, one day there's going to be LeBron James instead, or whatever the analogy you want to pick here is. And that's fascinating though, that monogamy is maybe kind of a workaround for that in a way. I'm a little concerned here though, because the other side of marriage as it pertains to economic success, like I understand what you're saying. Someone that's super motivated and single might all of a sudden get deflated in their motivation after they get married, right?
They can. I'm not saying it's necessary.
Yes.
Right.
And you heard that saying like fat and happy? Like couples get together that are like really in good shape, and then all of a sudden they get fat and happy. It's like they just stop caring. They stop competing, basically, so they get soft.
That's another great example, right? That their desire for romance channeled into athletics sort of suddenly goes away when that desire is satisfied, right?
Right. Well, when you're no longer competing on the dating market, like it sort of stands to reason that you might not try to stay in tip-top shape anymore. Of course, this is a generalization. It's not true for everyone. There's many couples that are in great shape and stay in good shape. But as it pertains to economic success in particular, there does seem to be this other side of it where like getting into there's a lot of studies that say happily married couples live longer, they're healthier, they tend to have higher incomes, higher net assets, etc. And so there's something, I think you get like this productivity unlock where like for a man, especially if you are single and you're dating, well, shit, that's a part-time job. That's
you're drinking on the weekends,
you're drinking,
hungover the next
you're
day,
spending money on trips or whatever things you're doing for the girls you're dating. Not that you won't be spending on your wife too, but you're very distracted, right? Like you're doing a lot of different things that aren't work. Whereas if you are married and you're in a good routine and with a supportive wife and all that, like you can really get dialed in on the productivity, I think, in a way that a single man can't.
Right. But observe what you just said is not in conflict, I think, with Rousseau's generalization in this specific way. What everything you described there was all the logistics around getting things done. Mm-hmm. Rousseau is talking about the switching of desires. So in other words, if your desires remain constant between being single, again, generalizing here, and after getting married, then you're probably going to be more productive. Because to your point, all those logistics around not having to date and having a steady routine are going to help those desires go further.
Yes.
But I think Rousseau's point, and the thing that's common that I'm seeing with many of my friends who settle down and get married, is that many of the times that desire weakens because their desire wasn't really to do the thing itself. It was to use that thing to get the woman, romance, or exactly, or it was literally they wanted to be the best in that domain because they didn't have a desire of being the best satisfied in another domain. So that's what you're seeing. So again, I think maybe let me put it this way: getting married is a test of whether the thing you're doing is actually something you like for its own sake.
Right.
If you get worse and worse at the thing you're doing after marriage, then maybe you didn't really want to do that in the first place. You're doing it for something else. If you get better and better, maybe that's because you get to double down on something you already love, right? So maybe that's a way to resolve what you're saying with what Rousseau's intuitions are.
That's a good point. And then because I would imagine, well, like Steve Jobs was married, right? So he got productivity unlock, and then he got to double down on this thing that he was obsessed with, which was probably selfishly his own glory or whatever. I don't know. Like when I think about, because I'm kind of a workaholic myself, and when I try to honestly reflect on like what's driving me, I sort of, and I don't know, I hope this is true. I do feel good adding value to other people's lives. Like genuinely will tell me, hey, that podcast you did or the thing you wrote really changed my life. Like that feels really good. I get fulfillment out of that. But when I get to like kind of the bottom of like why I'm always trying to push the envelope for me, it's something like trying to prove myself to myself. It's like you see all these very accomplished, and this is mimetic too, right? You see very competent, accomplished people around you, and you're like, well, I want to know if I can get to that level. Like
that's Zeal, right? That's Zeal again, and that's why I said my desires for creating this lecture series is largely selfish, because keep in mind the fact that you're happy, the fact that I'm happy when my work helps other people, doesn't mean that there's not other and perhaps even stronger desires and motivators.
Of course.
And I think someone like Nietzsche would want you to be okay with that fact, and not hide from it. But however, and this is where Rousseau comes in, you need to have guardrails around that selfish desire. Like like you can't just be caring about what everyone thinks. In fact, if you don't want to do that, you should probably be very cautious, be very explicit about who you care. Whose opinion you care about, right?
Yes.
You should be about limiting your content to the right people instead of trying to create maybe mass market stuff. So those are all the type of questions that these thinkers are going to force you to ask.
Yeah, those very interesting stuff. So fun to like put humanity under the microscope like this. Like you learn so much about yourself and your life, and it's a lot of fun. Let's do another pivot here. So you've talked about, well, let me just ask, what's going on with inequality in America, and how is that different than the equality we see in Canada? And I guess I want you to get very specific on what you mean by equality and inequality, because I know equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, all of these things get sort of merged together. But so like, what do you mean when you're talking about equality versus inequality?
So this was an example that I gave towards the end of one of my lectures on Rousseau's second discourse. And again, Rousseau's second discourse is this attempt to understand where inequality really comes from, right? Is inequality something natural that's always with us? Is it inequality maintained by the greed of a few conniving rich that are hoarding things for themselves? Is it inequality only specific to the type of capitalistic system we're in right now? I mean, Rousseau doesn't use those terms, but that's the kind of general question he's engaged in. Where does inequality really come from? It's mostly a critical work. Rousseau wants to show you all the different ways that inequality actually harms us. And what's really interesting is that Rousseau's pathways that inequality harms us is less so material, right? That the poor don't have enough to eat, but it's psychological. That high degrees of inequality drive a sort of frantic behavior between people where they constantly want to reach up top, right? And so one example I gave is in college, in elite colleges in America, the tech kids, the startup kids, are a lot more frenzied than the finance kids. Why is that? It's because the tech kids have a greater unequal cone of potential outcomes. So like the fact that you're empowered to potentially drop out tomorrow and raise $10 million makes you feel bad that you're not doing it. But the finance kid, the best thing you're going to get is your second year internship at Goldman, right? So your upside is capped.
Right.
And so this is actually one of the core reasons why certain people advocate for distribution of wealth. It's not, again, material. This is I think one of the points that John Rawls made, is that primarily flattening equality of outcome, not just opportunities, is to make people less jealous of each other. It's that sort of psychological benefit that they want to provide society. Now, okay, so that's like the brunt of the, and you can see, right, how that could be bad. Like, this is why there's so many hustlers and hucksters in the young tech startup crowd, right? Because they're driven by that frenzy and they're driven crazy. And you're made to feel like an absolute loser. Even if you drop out and run a startup, if you find out there's an 18-year-old who's already, I don't know, his company's already worth 9 figures, right? And so it's that type of psychological discomfort that Rousseau really taps into. Now, that's what the work is mostly about. But if you read between the lines, this inequality and this frenzy is actually responsible for creating, again, back to Nietzsche's idea of greatness in society. Rousseau says that this radical inequality and this frenzy that comes along with it is not only the source of all the bad things we have in society, but the source of philosophy and science, and we can add to it entrepreneurship. And the example I gave was, Canada has less of this frenzied inequality than America. But that's why America has its like billion-dollar companies, right? That same frenzy, which produces so many hucksters and suffering amongst the tech startup college kids, is also what gave us Facebook, Palantir, Microsoft. Right? These are all created by college kids. So it's really this dual aspect, this ambivalent nature of inequality that Rousseau is tapping into, which again perfectly kind of ties into everything we described today when it comes to greatness, when it comes to jealousy and its positive uses.
That's interesting too. So something like the spectrum of risk and reward is driving actual psychological dispositions or constitutions. Totally. I mean, I grew up in Beijing, and so many of the older people I grew up with were in communism.
And one thing they would say is, one thing they would look back to fondly when, you know, the market hadn't been instituted by Dung, was that everyone was kind of equal, even if they were less wealthy.
Right.
And so if you talk to people in Eastern Europe, you know, the thing that a lot of them miss is this idea of not having that psychological frenzy, because you could be a billionaire or you could be homeless. And that is worth a lot. And I think Rousseau is right to people. But the question is, what do you have to give up for that, right? And Dung, in his market reforms, went the other direction and said, you know, we'd rather get the productivity boost from inequalities that may come from the market economy, if that means that's going to lift everyone up materially.
Yes, like, and that's the libertarian view, right? Like, so, because again, if it's that risk-reward spectrum's driving psychological dispositions, well, what are we saying with the risk-reward spectrum? We're talking about incentives, ultimately, right? It's like, well, is there the possibility of hitting the 100x unicorn? And if there is, well, then maybe I'll go crazy and work hard and raise money and drop out, do all of these, take all these risks, right, in the pursuit of that reward. But if that possibility doesn't exist, then you're going to have someone that's much less motivated,
Italy,
much less creative.
Mediterranean,
right. Yeah, just much more, complacent, I guess, in general. So that obviously points to the importance of incentives, which, I think you called it like the frenzy. That frenzy is almost synonymous with social mobility, right? It's like, if that frenzy is not occurring, then it's this hierarchy is static, basically.
Well, that frenzy is zeal, right? Again, it's zeal. It's seeing something, a positive thing that you want to do better. But again, and this is where we're going back to one of the core themes of the great books, is that zeal does have negatives. It does create a culture that often produces, again, like hucksters and swindlers and people who are radically unhappy. But what Rousseau is doing is that he's showing you the trade-off, right? Think back to what Kant calls it, the Newton of the moral world. He's showing you these levers that, hey, if you do this in the moral world, this is going to happen, right? Yeah.
No, that's a great point. But the productivity boosts that come from that I would agree, like, you can't, that is the most important thing. Like, if you can increase wealth per capita, even if you're going to have more asymmetric spread of the returns in a way, right? It's still increasing wealth per capita, which is like how you increase the standard of living for everyone ultimately, especially through innovation, right? Like, once you discover the refrigerator once, it's like you've changed everyone's life everywhere forever. Like, everyone that will ever come after you now has a refrigerator, you know, like, you didn't have that before. And so if the cost of that was like, oh, we dispossessed some people and they felt, you know, jealous of those that succeeded. So again, so long as they weren't like directly coerced, I mean, again, this would be the libertarian in me coming out, and then like the cost of that dispossession is worth the reward of the refrigerator, right? Like, and I'm just choosing one innovation that really altered history. And so, I hear you though, right? Like, the hucksters and the scammers and all that would also generate those who are presumably resentful of the competent, successful entrepreneurs, right? They're trying to fake it till they make it kind of thing. And even actually harming people, right? Deceiving them, stealing from them. Well, let's create good disincentives to that, right? Via the rule of law, like make sure the legal system is penalizing that. It's about the best way you can deal with it, so far as I know. But
there's actually another way to actually potentially deal with this, which is jealousy. And this is a Girardian idea. Is something that traffics a lot amongst equals. So, for example, my billionaire mentors, I'm not jealous of because we're so different. But another 26-year-old like entrepreneur who's made a little more than me, that's going to inspire a lot more jealousy than billionaires. And so the intuition here is perhaps one reading of why jealousy traffics so much in modernity isn't the fact of inequality. I mean, humans have been unequal for long stretches of time. It's this ideal of equality that's really causing the problem. that might lead you back to the more Nietzschean view, right? Is that we need to get rid of this idea that we're all sort of equals in one specific sense, right?
That's
we
right.
might want to preserve equality over law or something, but we want to get out of this idea that we should be just equal, like, per se.
Yeah, and the treatment of this topic we've given on this show is that equality of opportunity is completely bogus, right? No human is ever born in the same place at the same time with the same genetics, with the same social capital, financial capital, etc. So like that doesn't exist. Equality of opportunity does not exist. Quality of outcome obviously doesn't exist. Like if you're going to guarantee everyone having the same outcome, there's only one possibility for that. There's only one place that all humans are actually equal, and that is in the grave, right? Like we all are mortal, basically. In no other case are we all equal in any phase of life. The only equality that I think is actually, it's the equality that we actually want, if we apply some critical thinking to it, is equality in the eyes of the law, right? We want the rules of the game to be fixed and incorruptible so that we can all play the game and see who the winners are, right? And you might not win, you might lose, but at least you know that that you could give a winning performance and still lose if the rules are changeable. And this leads into my, frustration of central banking and statism and fiat regulation and all of that. Like it's basically that, right? Like you can lose even if you give a winning performance as an entrepreneur, right? Tax policy or whatever, it can just destroy you. So, and this also reminds me too, if you try to really optimize for equality of outcome or equality of opportunity, you end up with that situation they had in Soviet Russia where they said they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work, right? It's like this just army of unmotivated people that are totally faking it because there's no incentive. You don't win if you work harder. So it's just like if you send people money for unemployment and they're getting paid to stay at home. Well, guess what? They're not going to go to work. You're paying them to stay at home. So, it's crazy. So yeah, I'd be very skeptical of, I think you said something about Rousseau saying that there were, or maybe it wasn't Rousseau, sorry. Someone was saying that it's not so much the economic benefits that policies of equality give us, it's more of these psychological benefits. I would go back to the earlier point that was, psychological dispositions are very closely tied to economic conditions and incentives. So I would really try to optimize for productivity and economic conditions and let the psychology sort of flow behind that.
Yeah, you wouldn't be alone, right? That would
Right.
be the modern way to think about that. Yeah.
So what am I missing there then? What is the argument that am I over-indexing on economics as a driver of psychological benefits?
Sorry, when you say over-indexing, what do you think Rousseau is claiming that you're not following? Maybe I misled
I'm
you
not
there.
sure if it was Rousseau or not, but I thought you said someone was saying it's not so much these policies of equality, like they might not give you economic equality, but they give you psychological equality or benefits.
So I was referring to one of Rawls' arguments for why economic equality is desirable. He's not. I don't remember him saying that it's primarily because of that, but he's just giving you one reason why.
Gotcha.
And that reason is that it produces a psychological, it reduces that kind of psychological frenzy. And again, I think that is a right observation, but you just got to put that in perspective to the other things that such a policy is going to affect, right?
Yeah. Again, it's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as far as I could tell, right? Because you want that frenzy, really. You want the variability.
Yeah, and so this is a very interesting intuition because Rousseau is traditionally considered as egalitarian, right? Which is partially why I chose to start off with him and Nietzsche, one traditionally on the left and one on the right. But not really. I mean, one of Rousseau's advice to Poland is to create a system of never-ending competition, where the citizens are motivated to perform like virtuous deeds, and you can literally climb up the social hierarchy all the way to being a monarch So it's highly meritocratic. It's kind of like what you suggested in some sense, that the rules are fixed about how you advance, but it's kind of a free-for-all within there.
Right.
Highly hierarchical. Like it's not even like current capitalism where the structure itself is hierarchical. And you can advance to like monarch, to becoming the monarch. And even for the monarch, you have to look forward to whether you're going to be celebrated or not after your death. So Rousseau is not against inequality per se. I think, first of all, he's against bad forms of inequality, like inequality directed towards improper places. But even, I think he would say, even when inequality is directed to good places, like this Poland example, it still creates a frenzy, and that might just be a necessary negative that we just have to bite the bullet on.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, you just can't have equality of opportunity or outcome. So it's like the frenzy is just, that's part of the deal, basically. I just draw the analogy of sports again, right? It's like, imagine if you had equality of outcome or opportunity in sports. Like, it wouldn't make any sense. There would be no game, right? The only equality you really want in sports is the rules of the game should be evenly applied across all players in all games, right? Obviously, the rules change a little bit from season to season or whatever it may be, but they're at least applied evenly every time they're changed, right? It's not like there's rules for thee, not for me kind of thing. And if you could imagine if any player could ever come into the power of rule-making authority, that totally destroys the game, right? Because if you can control the rules, well, that's the power to win in perpetuity. So what do we want in a good society? It's the same thing we want in good sports, that with fixed rules that are evenly applied, that update slowly, if ever. I mean, obviously you got to change the rules occasionally and tweak them, but at least apply them evenly to everyone. And then besides that, let it be a free-for-all, right? That's how you get the Michael Jordans. If you don't you're never going to have all-stars and all of those things.
And I think Rousseau's suggestion for Poland is not too far from what you just suggested, right? Yeah. Where Rousseau clearly thinks that people are born with different abilities, and he clearly is fine with a hierarchical outcome. The whole system is a hierarchy, and the rules are, like you said, somewhat fixed and transparent, and it's about people competing for these virtuous deeds.
Yeah, man, so many interesting things to think about. Is there anything else we should jump into, or do you have any final words for the audience?
No, I mean, I think this is a great conversation that is a lot more coherent than I think both of us intended it to be coming in, right, with these scattered ideas. And I think it's this thread of jealousy and sociality and imitation that kind of pulses through all of this. So not really. I just hope that people like the lecture and interview series. The interviews are a lot more academic with top scholars, and they're really deep dives. And so we spend the entire 2 hours talking about what's the good way to seek recognition and what's a bad way, for example. Whereas the lectures are a lot more just, here's the TLDR of the book. So I really hope people enjoy that.
Awesome. Well, Johnathan, thank you again for coming on. It's always fun to talk to you. You definitely get my brain sizzling on a lot of these things.
Hey, you and me both.
Where can people find you on the internet?
Greatbooks.io. That will take you to my page where I'll have all my lectures and interviews. Or if you want to go to YouTube directly, you can just search Johnathan Bi, and all my lectures will be for free and pop up.
Awesome. Thank you again, and we'll talk again soon.
Awesome, man. Thanks.